When Dr. Seuss is mentioned in modern society, people respond in a variety of ways. Some reminisce fondly about their childhood with his captivating and colorful characters such as the Grinch, the Lorax, Horton, and the Cat in the Hat. On the other hand, others criticize his early works for perpetuating racism and sexism, leading some to dismiss his entire body of work. Can we separate the racist imagery present in some of his works from the colorful stories we all grew up with? Is there a place for Dr. Seuss in our modern society? I'm Lorne, and on Everything is Gray, we delve into the societal impact of artists and individuals who have profoundly influenced our lives. We strive to reconcile their contributions with their actions and beliefs. Some of Dr. Seuss's work, particularly in his early years, was rife with racist imagery, the perpetuation of racial stereotypes, and even the use of racial slurs, with one black slur that had the hard R. Many people categorize themselves into two camps: those who vehemently criticize and dismiss Dr. Seuss as a complete racist, and those who completely overlook his racist imagery, choosing instead to remember him as the beloved children's author they grew up with. Some even pretend or assert that his racist past is irrelevant, while racism is always relevant. Outside of these two camps, the majority of the population still wants to embrace Dr. Seuss and his legacy. There may be those who may not have been aware of his racist imagery or simply don't care to learn about it. Alternatively, we might simply want to cling to the fantastical stories and whimsical imagery that have captivated our imagination since childhood. These stories have spawned countless adaptations that are still being produced today. But where do you stand? Let's dive in. Dr. Seuss, born Theodor Seuss Geisel in 1904, which is the way it would have been pronounced in the original German. He grew up in Springfield, Massachusetts, the birthplace of the soon-to-be infamous Mulberry Street. Back then, Springfield was a thriving and innovative manufacturing town, ranking as one of the top manufacturing cities in Massachusetts. After high school, Geisel attended Dartmouth College, graduating in 1925 with a Bachelor of Arts degree in English. During his time at Dartmouth, he began to gain recognition as a writer and illustrator. He served as the writer and later became the editor-in-chief of the Dartmouth Jack-o'-lantern magazine, a humor magazine published by students on campus. However, it was during this period that the darker aspects of Geisel's early work began to surface. While involved with the Jack-o'-lantern, Dr. Seuss is rumored to have participated in a minstrel show. Minstrel shows, a popular form of theater entertainment in the 1800s, featured white actors in blackface, perpetuating harmful stereotypes of African Americans. Although Geisel's involvement is mentioned, specific details are lacking. While minstrel shows weren't particularly popular in the US during the early 20s, their stereotypes and bigotry eventually found their way into radio, film, and eventually television. Most of Geisel's work for the Jack-o'-lantern was quite harmless. In fact, it might have even been amusing if you were a student at Dartmouth during the 1920s. Speaking of the 1920s, a pivotal era in the United States had just commenced, which would profoundly impact Geisel's life. This era was marked by the enactment of Prohibition, which commenced in 1920. Prohibition was an ineffective measure that effectively banned alcohol in the United States. While at Dartmouth, Geisel was caught drinking alcohol with several of his fellow students. As a result, he was banished from extracurricular activities, including his participation in the Jack-o'-lantern magazine. Undeterred, he decided to use his middle name, Seuss, as an alias, only changing the pronunciation to the anglicized Seuss. His work as a cartoonist for the magazine was then signed under the name that would extend beyond his lifetime. However, using just your middle name as an alias to evade punishment might just be the worst alias idea ever. After graduating from Dartmouth, Geisel enrolled at Lincoln College, Oxford as a Doctor of Philosophy and English Literature. During his time at Oxford, he met Helen Palmer, who would later become his first wife. However, Geisel decided to leave his graduate studies after only 1 year, influenced by Helen's encouragement for him to pursue a career in drawing. After dropping out of his doctorate program, Geisel returned to the United States. Initially, he freelanced as a cartoonist for magazines like Judge and the Saturday Evening Post. In 1928, he found success in the advertising industry. Around this time, he added the doctor to his pen name, inspired by his father's long-standing desire for him to become a doctor. One of his most infamous problematic works was published in 1929 when he wrote for Judge magazine. The title of the comic was Cross-Section of the World's Most Prosperous Department Store. In this comic, the final panel features extremely racist caricatures of black people that are for sale. The caption even takes it a step further by stating, "Take home a high-grade N-word for your woodpile, satisfaction guaranteed." Now, there is absolutely no excuse for such a blatant display of racism and stereotyping. This panel, along with others, is based upon an old racist idiom of an N-word in the woodpile. Thankfully, its usage has declined in the United States. Dr. Seuss, as I'll refer to him from now on, continued to produce racist drawings in his work with the advertising industry. He primarily collaborated with the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, which would later become Exxon. His primary advertising product was Flit, an insecticide marketed to the consumer market. While most of his ads were harmless, several featured racist caricatures. He primarily stereotyped African natives, drawing them only slightly different than he would of a monkey. Seuss's advertising career spanned approximately 15 years until the onset of World War II. Prior to World War II, in 1937, Dr. Seuss published his first truly original children's book, And to Think I Saw It on Mulberry Street. This book introduced the world to Seuss's distinctive illustrations and whimsical tetrameter rhyming verses. Mulberry Street received generally positive reviews and was a modest success in the publishing industry. Mulberry Street also became one of his works to draw controversy, a controversy that elicited a change, ultimately approved by Dr. Seuss himself 40 years later in 1978. On the page was the derogatory term Chinaman, which was commonly used in the early 20th century. It was revised to a Chinese man. Seuss also approved the change of his yellow coloring to white like the other characters on the page. However, the character was still displayed as a complete racist stereotype. Beyond the hurtful Chinese stereotype, the book also included images that could be considered stereotypes of two Inuit people being pulled in a sled by a turbaned figure riding an elephant. These stereotypes were later used in some of his early books after World War II. Even with the changes to the text and the coloring, it wasn't sufficient, as years later, Dr. Seuss Enterprises withdrew Mulberry Street and 5 additional books because they contained potentially harmful content. Although a total of 6 books were removed, Mulberry Street was undoubtedly the most well-known of these books. Beginning with the lead up to World War II, Dr. Seuss joined the PM newspaper as an editorial cartoonist. As usual, he signed his artwork under his pen name Dr. Seuss. PM was a daily newspaper in New York City, where Dr. Seuss launched his scathing critique of Charles Lindbergh. Now, prior to World War II, Lindbergh and the original America First Committee, which vehemently opposed any U.S. intervention in Europe, in stark contrast, Dr. Seuss held a different viewpoint. He aligned himself with Franklin Roosevelt during that period, and many of his early political cartoons in PM magazine reflected it. But in his political comics, racial stereotypes of Japanese and Japanese Americans were used. He even supported the internment of Japanese Americans, depicting them as alley cats and using a shortened racial slur, declaring that there's a hell of a lot of them. In this particularly egregious example, Seuss is critical of Japanese Americans. It depicts Japanese Americans living on the West Coast being handed blocks of TNT while implying that they are secretly working for the Emperor of Japan. To put things into context, other cartoonists during World War II also drew similar racially derogatory depictions. However, there were no calls to ban the works of Clifford K. Berryman. This is likely because he doesn't have the same legacy aimed at children that Dr. Seuss did. However, during his political cartooning era, Dr. Seuss adopted a respectful stance towards Black Americans. Many of his comics from that period criticized racial prejudice against Black individuals, particularly the discrimination that prevented Black people from participating in the U.S. war effort. Shortly after World War II, Dr. Seuss resumed his work on children's books. This initial decade produced most of the books that Dr. Seuss Enterprises later decided to withdraw from publication. These are often regarded as his lesser-known works, barely selling any copies over the past few decades. However, there's a recurring theme here. A few of these books, such as McElligot's Pool and Scrambled Egg Super, are believed to have been removed from circulation due to racist imagery depicting native people from the Alaskan and Arctic regions. McElligot's Pool even included the word Eskimo, which has fallen out of favor as a description of Inuit and other Arctic tribes. Beyond a stereotyping of Arctic natives, there's also problematic images and depictions of Middle Eastern and Asian people that would certainly raise more eyebrows than I have, and certainly not stereotypes we would want children to see. But in 1953, Dr. Seuss visited Japan, meeting the people and witnessing the devastation of Hiroshima caused by the atomic bomb. This experience profoundly impacted his next book, which was dedicated to my great friend Mitsugi Nakamura of Kyoto, Japan. Seuss and Nakamura became instant friends touring schools of Japan. Their friendship spanned decades afterward. With the inspiration from Nakamura and Japan, in 1954, Dr. Seuss gifted the world one of his most cherished books, Horton Hears a Who. This book, a sequel to Horton Hatches the Egg, brought back the beloved elephant Horton. Through these two books, Horton embodies the importance of self-belief and standing up for what is right, even in the face of opposition. This book beautifully conveys the message that a person's a person no matter how small. Many scholars believe that the publication of Horton Hears a Who was his sincere apology for his portrayal of Japanese Americans as stereotypes and his support for their internment, particularly since it was inspired by his trip to visit Japan. Now, Horton Hears a Who isn't without its critics. Even in the children's book world, where a powerful and positive message is conveyed, people will always find a way to criticize it. In their argument, Horton is portrayed as the embodiment of the white savior complex, where the Whos are likened to an exotic, backward culture that needs to be rescued. In my opinion, this is a wild overreach, and the kind of self-justification academics resort to, attempting to save us from the perceived harm of an endearing children's book. In 1957, Dr. Seuss introduced his most iconic character, the Cat in the Hat, which became synonymous with his name. The genesis of this book can be traced back to the early education landscape in the United States. In 1955, author Rudolph Flesch published Why Johnny Can't Read and What You Can Do About It. This book was a critique of the popular Dick and Jane books, which employed the look-say method to teach reading. A friend of Dr. Seuss suggested that he compose a book with a restricted vocabulary, specifically designed for first-grade students. This resulted in the creation of The Cat in the Hat, which boasted a remarkable vocabulary of just 236 distinct words. It is rumored that Dr. Seuss reviewed a list of words that children that age should be familiar with, and the initial rhyming words that he came across were cat and hat. The book at the time garnered rave reviews. Many reviewers lauded its clever use of one-syllable rhyming words, complemented by the vibrant illustrations. However, when it came to schools and teachers, many were hesitant to embrace The Cat in the Hat. They perceived it as too irreverent, and as we all know, children detest irreverence in their literature. These educators have been using the conventional Dick and Jane primers for years. Nevertheless, sales of the books to parents surged. The Cat in the Hat went on to sell millions of copies over the years and has been translated into over 12 languages, propelling Dr. Seuss himself into global fame. However, the character of the Cat in the Hat has come under fire from some academics. They have tried to tie the character of the Cat in the Hat to having its origins in racial caricatures, minstrel performances, and blackface. Some of these characteristics that they point out are his bow tie, umbrella, and zany personality. In reality, there are comparisons that can be made, if you make his appearance racist as your thesis and try to prove that goal. But this is an example of confirmation and academic bias. Despite this attempt to stir controversy, the Cat in the Hat has captivated generations with his playful and mischievous personality, his whimsical design, his boundless imagination, and his harmonious blend of rebellion and responsibility. Parents adore him because he transforms reading into an enjoyable experience through captivating rhymes that ignite children's imaginations, paving the way for them to discover the joy of reading. At the dawn of the 1970s environmental movement, Dr. Seuss published one of his most beloved books, the Lorax. This book has been adapted several times since its original release and serves as a powerful critique of unsustainable environmental damage and its profound impact on both present and future generations. Of all the organizations that have protested Dr. Seuss, this one wound up attracting protests from the logging industry, with one industry parent saying, "To teach our children that harvesting redwood trees is bad is not the education we need." I think it's safe to say that this Dr. Seuss protest didn't gain much traction. In 1990, Dr. Seuss published the final book during his lifetime, Oh, the Places You Will Go. I'm certain everyone received at least 3 copies of this book during their high school graduation. Shortly after its publication, Dr. Seuss passed away at the age of 87 in 1991. Dr. Seuss's legacy is complex, sparking debates among detractors, apologists, and those seeking to exploit it for political gain. There have even been calls for the complete censorship of his books in public libraries and schools. On the other hand, some believe his books are entirely free of any wrongdoing. In 2021, when Dr. Seuss Enterprises released the statement, "Today on Dr. Seuss's birthday, Dr. Seuss Enterprises celebrates reading and also our mission of supporting all children and families with messages of hope, inspiration, inclusion, and friendship. We are committed to action. To that end, Dr. Seuss Enterprises, working with a panel of experts including educators, reviewed our catalog of titles and made the decision last year to cease publication and licensing of the following titles: And I Think I Saw It on Mulberry Street, If I Ran the Zoo, McElligot's Pool, On Beyond Zebra, Scrambled Egg Super, and The Cat's Quizzer. These books portray people in ways that are hurtful and wrong. Ceasing sales of these books is only part of our commitment and our broader plan to ensure Dr. Seuss Enterprises' catalog represents and supports all communities and families." And the whole world praised this common sense statement and went about their lives. Of course they didn't. Politics stepped in. Many people were whining about cancel culture, but there's nothing wrong with artists and organizations reevaluating the work they put out and determining what best represents their values. And as we know, the values of a society changes over the years, whether you like it or not. It's not censorship. If Elon Musk can delete his dumbass tweets, then Dr. Seuss Enterprises can certainly pull the publication of a few books, particularly ones that didn't sell very well. But there's also the problem of Dr. Seuss's older work, especially the racially insensitive political cartoons. Academics and organizations have complained that Dr. Seuss had the opportunity to apologize for his early works for decades, but chose not to. But what those academics and organizations fail to do is realize the culture of expecting an apology for everything is relatively new. And even when you get an apology, they usually fall flat, in that they're merely expected and rarely accepted. Is his early work racist? Of course it is. And racism always matters. But it also matters what we do with it, how we teach our children, how we explain the history that matters as well. My opinion of Dr. Seuss is best summed up by this statement from an academic that I've grown to respect researching this video, Philip Nell, when he says, "Embrace Dr. Seuss's poetic brilliance, but reject the toxicity of his racism or his sexism. When you embrace all of it, you poison yourself and others." So go on, get that Cat in the Hat tattoo if you want. Share these brilliant stories with your kids, or reread them again as an adult like I have and be transported back to your childhood. And be like Horton the Elephant and stand up for what you believe in, regardless of those around you. My name is Lauren with Everything is Gray. Thanks for watching. Everything is Gray is a weekly video series which also has a much longer detailed audio podcast available on your favorite podcasting app. So if you're looking for more in-depth exploration, be sure to check those out.